So I have to see when we have that. Oh, it's a review of processes used by petroleum refineries to meet increasing demand for high-octane gasoline by Y. Zhang and B. H. Davis, again, from the University of Kentucky. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Harold will probably give his talk better next door than I did here. To start reforming, in 1925, Model A's, I guess Model A's weren't around, Model T's didn't really need much octane, and so just straight run gasoline was all that was needed. So quality was not a question, it was just quantity. So thermal cracking and catalytic cracking was the process primarily to increase the quantity rather than the quality. This is from Charlie Thomas' talk of about 1950, and this was his version of petroleum processing in 1930. You had distillation, you had some thermal cracking, and then you treated it either with clay or with acid to stabilize it. And that's about all you did in the refinery. This again is his slide version of what UOP was doing in 1931. They were seeking specific processes. They had Apatieff working on gasoline desulfurization, Tropes working on catalytic reforming, and Herman Pines and A.V. Gross were doing exploratory work. Apparently they changed things fast because in 1932 to 33, the research was Apatieff working on polymerization of gases, and that's what he did an awful lot of with UOP and developed a lot of the oligomerization processes that gave them the high-octane oligomers. Tropes had changed to catalytic cracking. Herman Pines was working on paraffin isomerization, and Gross was working on alkylation. Gross subsequently left there and went to the Manhattan Project, where he was involved with the Manhattan Project. As Ola pointed out this morning, Tropes became terminally ill and went back to Germany shortly after that. This is a UOP picture of Hans Tropes, and this is Apatieff and Pines in the lab. Back then you had to be formal if you worked in the lab, since they're wearing their ties and suit. This is Apatieff with Gomberg of organic fame with free radicals. What I call the holy grail of reforming dates back to 1936. These are 3 papers in Russian journals that relate to converting paraffin to aromatic. The one which became more well known was Kazansky, who had worked on dehydrocyclization for many, many years. These are usually attributed to being the first, but Gross of UOP had this in a paper in 1940 that the announcement of the discovery of the patent application and publication, and this was on dehydrocyclization, was delayed as a result of their discussions with the War Department. They saw this as a way of making high-octane gasoline. Now, it's ironic because the Kilgore Committee investigated after the war, and UOP had been giving to the Japanese the high-octane possibility of cracking, even when some of the companies owning UOP couldn't have access to it. So there was a lot of politics involved in petroleum refining and what they do process-wise at that time. His results are pretty astounding in that they're getting, with recycle, something over 90% recovery from heptane dehydrocyclization. That's probably better than we can do today. And so they had a very good process. He did point out that unsupported catalysts lost activity, but if you put it on as support, it would maintain activity for days at least. The one that I don't have on the list that I've only included more recently is Turkevich and Hugh Taylor at Princeton. Apparently, Dobie Keith came to Hugh Taylor and asking to come visit him, or he called him on phone to come visit. Taylor said he didn't have time to come to New York. He said, what if I had $7,000 for you to do research? He said he had time to go to New York. And so he worked on dehydrocyclization, and they came up with chromia as a catalyst for normal heptane dehydrocyclization at the same time. So there's at least 5 who were to be credited for dehydrocyclization discovery at essentially the same time. The first process was hydroforming. This was introduced in 1939. It was fixed bed when it was introduced. It involved molybdenum on alumina catalyst, operating in the same temperatures we do reforming today, pressures in the range of current reforming. The time on stream was not very long, and so you had to regenerate frequently. 2 to 12 hours is not very long. But this was the process that let them develop the high-octane gasoline for the Second World War. And so the naphtha reforming dates, or the high-octane gasoline dates back to this hydroforming. And I say during the Second World War, the plants were operated. They operated on very narrow cuts which had high methyl cyclohexane so that they would have a high yield of toluene. And so it was really dehydrogenation rather than dehydrocyclization that gave the high octane. They never did really use dehydrocyclization. It's much like Fischer-Tropsch. Everyone says that Fischer-Tropsch made a lot of, that the German army operated on product from Fischer-Tropsch. It was really direct liquefaction, and Fischer-Tropsch was a minor component. Dehydrocyclization contributed a minor component to the toluene of the Second World War. But it did introduce scientific concepts as well. Now, it's hard to realize today that surface area was a new technique in 1938, but that's when the BT method equation for determining surface area was introduced. So people were concentrating on surface area at that time. It was the first real way to reliably compare catalysts from one lab to another, is to compare it on the base surface area. And so activity here is linearly related to the surface area. If we look at the molybdenum reforming catalyst, here the activity increases, reaches a constant value as you get to a monolayer. So that if you were to take the surface area in this paper and calculate reasonable coverage for molybdenum oxide, the monolayer would fall about where the activity changes. Another catalyst that was popular was chromia. It never really got used that much for this purpose. Phillips used it for another purpose and made it much more popular, but for dehydrocyclization it was studied a lot. And here is what happens as you increase the chromia. The activity declines. Professor Selwood worked on magnetic measurements, and this is one of the early correlations of catalyst characterization to catalytic activity, so that the magnetization change follows pretty closely the activity change. So this was one of the early characterizations relating to catalytic activity. Again, at least driven by the naphtha reforming type chemistry. One process that was rather limited and rather unique was one from Amoco. It's isoforming, and it only worked on the thermally cracked naphtha. It presumably, and this employed a poor cracking catalyst, so you could even use an aged cracking catalyst for this. Apparently, it was just transferring hydrogen from the naphthenes to the olefins that are formed in cracking to increase the octane, because they have a tremendous yield up to 99%. And so it certainly couldn't involve much cracking. Since this is ACS meeting, this was just 50 years ago. This is the preprint in 1951 of the fall ACS meeting. And to me, it's an amazing meeting. I'm not going through all of the papers there, but the names are of historical significance. Greensfelder was one of the first to look at mechanisms of catalytic cracking, did much with model compounds at Shell in the 1930s. Houdry Corporation and the Sun represented catalytic cracking. Murphy from Standard, New Jersey, with fluid cracking, the one who gave the impetus to fluid cracking. Hensel, who's comparing platforming and thermal reforming. All kinds of, you go on down, Arnold and P.C. Keith, who is Dobie Keith. He's the one who started the Brownville plant for Fischer-Tropsch process. He's also the one who was responsible for the membrane for separating uranium isotopes during the Manhattan Project. He was in charge of building the diffusion plant at Oak Ridge. And so these are some significant people who were here 50 years ago. And so it's appropriate to at least remember what some of them did. See. I knew you had the wrong title, but I don't remember what time I stopped. At that meeting, Kellogg was announcing a new process. They had taken the fluid cracking technology and adapted to reforming. So rather than the fixed bed, they were now doing the fluid bed hydroforming. And this was an improvement, not to be outdone. Standard of Jersey announced that they also had been working on this, and that their results were very similar to what Kellogg was reporting. The fluid used a reactor and a regeneration and transported the catalyst around in the fluid phase, so that here you could regenerate continuously and be able to be on stream continuously. Not only that, but the lower carbon was an advantage from the catalytic point of view, because if you look at a given gasoline or a given octane, you get a higher yield from the fluid bed operation than from fixed bed operation. Now in the preprint, I reported Bill Hettinger's memory, and he thought that the plant in Whiting, Indiana blew up in 1957. I got an email, so this is an advantage of putting things on paper. Someone's always going to tell you you're wrong. And so George Lester tells me it had to be earlier because in 1956 he was a summer student there, and they were already leveling the rubble from the explosion, which must have been in 1955. So.
I started working for Phillips Petroleum. It was 1956 and it was October.
Oh, well, George, I have to correct George's memory. He must have been there in 1957.
I'd been to Phillips about 4 months ago.
I lived in Riverdale, Illinois, and my dad worked in Hammond. And as we drove over, I saw the fire from the plant. Yeah.
It was October of
Yeah.
56.
And I was about 12 or 13 years old at the time. And I was impressed.
I was going back to Oil and Gas Journal and find out from, so I can look in 1956 then.
Look, October 10th.
Okay. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh, it was on the weekend.
Yeah, well, Bill said he was on the weekend and he was putting a roof on his house, but he must have been off by, it took him a long time to get the roof on. This is the one Hensel got 2 patents in 1949, I believe, 48, 49. I didn't get the, that covers the use of balanced acidic metal function for naphtha reforming. And this really transformed naphtha reforming. It transformed petroleum because now it was easy to get the high yield of naphtha, plus there was a large excess of hydrogen. And so I meant to cover this up. Just the platinum chloride catalyst was the first one. I keep sending Hensel into the Inventors Hall of Fame, but they keep overlooking him each time. The Inventors Hall of Fame must only like catalytic cracking because they have Burton as a member from thermal cracking. They now have Houdry, they have Charlie Plank, Ed Brzezinski from catalyst, but they won't go for naphtha reforming. Now, for the first commercial plant, they were having open house in Michigan, and Hensel, he said he was told by the president of UOP that he should put out a sample of the catalyst. And so he took this to mean that he should put out a sample that had been fixed up so that it had added to it most of the elements of a periodic table. And so they had it sitting there, a big gallon jar of it or so. And the visitors each would take a handful and go home and analyze it to find out what this new catalyst was. And it presumably had the whole periodic table. But as the president suspected, everyone was there eager to get a sample, and so they got a sample, but it didn't help them very much. It was amazing, or at least I was told when I visited Texaco on an interview a few years after that they tried this and it was unheard of that you use a small amount of supported catalyst. They're talking 10% or so. And so they put 10% platinum on alumina and it was a worthless catalyst. And they began to think UOP was not being very honest. And it took a lot of work for them to get it low enough platinum where it really was effective. One of the academic things that came from naphtha reforming is this Mills, the effect of bifunctional catalysis. They put it in a picture that is a little difficult to follow, but the normal hexane goes to isohexane, to the cyclo-C5, to the aromatic. It's all correct, but it didn't get that much publicity. In or understanding. It wasn't in a very good package for people in academic circles to understand. A better one, and how good it is, this chapter or volume is missing from the library at work because someone liked the chapter also, and I forgot to bring mine in and make copy from the book. But this is Weiss, who wrote a chapter on polyfunctional catalysis in which he put it in a very good framework, physical, chemistry, kinetics, etc. And has been referred to, when I was at Johns Hopkins, someone from the medical school recalled the volume that I had checked out on this. So even people in the medical school looked at this. This gave a lot of impetus to research in catalysis, polyfunctional catalysis. Another which can be traced to it is from John Sinfeld. This is alloy catalyst. And the difference that an alloy catalyst may not have the same functionality for different reactions. So if you add copper to nickel, for cyclohexane dehydrogenation, it does very little for a long time. Whereas to decrease hydrogenolysis a little bit causes a great decrease. And so the potential of using alloy catalyst to moderate different reactions to a different extent can be traced to the naphtha reforming. John Sinfeld spent years working on naphtha reforming as Exxon tried to develop their own process. The next one, I still don't know the genesis of this. Platinum rhenium came out of Chevron in the 1960s. It was crucial to start up with sulfur in the feed. Now everyone working on catalyst of platinum at that time knew you didn't put sulfur around it. So how someone would go to their supervisor and say, I want money to study putting sulfur on platinum catalyst so that I will be able to improve the catalyst, was a good salesperson. I don't know how they did it, but nevertheless, it came in. It was to be announced shortly after the first North American meeting. I happened to be a young employee at Mobil at that time. Ended up at dinner table, banquet table with a group from Chevron. And so they asked me what I was working on, and I say bimetallic catalyst. And for the rest of the night, they are pumping me about what am I doing on bimetallic catalyst. Now you might remember that Mobil had just come out with a commercial zeolite catalyst in the middle 60s. Chevron had this in a plant but hadn't announced it, and so they didn't want Mobil to be coming out. They had no fear because I was the only one at Mobil working on bimetallic. Everyone was working on zeolites, and they had no interest in the little platinum tin catalyst that I was working on. And so that's why I put that. It was interesting, but it never got far. The platinum reforming catalyst, the introduction of it, this is from a business book. It was introduced and very rapidly was incorporated. Now, these lines refer to what this person classified as three types of companies. One had very poor process technology, one had intermediate, and one had excellent. The ones who were intermediate and excellent incorporated it rapidly. The ones who were excellent only incorporated it to a small extent. Less than half of those who had excellent technology utilized and changed. They kept the old refining technology because they already had it in place. The intermediate ones, the weak that didn't have any, very quickly took it. And so this is a classic from that point of view. Let me just finish with the processes that were in operation by 1960. There's a large number of them. If we look at the capacity, we will see that platforming, the UOP process, was the dominant process in 1958, and it remained the dominant process until platinum rhenium catalyst. The Holy Grail was finally attained, and I won't go into it, when Chevron came up with the platinum KL, which is very selective for converting even normal hexane to aromatics. And so with that, I will stop.
Any questions?